It's my pleasure to introduce Maggie Shipstead. She's the author of Seating Arrangements and Astonish Me. Seating Arrangements won the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Art Seidemann Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction. Her third novel, Great Circle, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and that is a very big deal. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. She's also our neighbor, as she lives in Los Angeles. I have loved all of her books. Great Circle tells the story of Marion Graves, an aviatrix of the early 1930s, who is bankrolled by a wealthy bootlegger. Like Amelia Earhart, she becomes an aviation icon. A century later, actress Hadley Baxter is cast to play Marion in a film about the pilot's disappearance in Antarctica. It is epic in the true sense of the word. The book toggles back and forth over a century of time, exploring the life of Marion Graves and the actress who will portray her. Great Circle takes flight across decades and continents. We've been living in difficult times these past few years. One of my friends, who is grappling with long COVID, confided to me that Great Circle was the only book that she could read to the end and enjoy during this challenging time. In my opinion, one of the best parts was its length of over 700 pages. I just hate it when a good read comes to an end. Maggie took her time to tell this story, and I enjoyed every minute.
Hi there. Thank you so much to the Pasadena Literary Alliance for having me and for organizing this, for everyone who came today. It's so amazing to be back doing in-person events. Great Circle came out in May 2021, so it just sort of felt like a simulation for many months doing Zoom events. And to the other authors as well, it's been such a joy to listen to all of you talk today. I'm mostly going to talk about Great Circle because writing Great Circle was really a journey in and of itself. When I talk about Great Circle, I usually start with a story about a statue. There's a statue of a pilot named Gene Batten, and it's outside the Auckland International Terminal. But I'll do a brief, condensed version of the other part of my writing journey, just sort of the mechanics of how I became a writer. So I grew up in Orange County. I never wanted to be a writer, although I was always a reader. I went to Harvard for college. I studied English and American literature. I took a few creative writing classes, but it just didn't seem viable to me to be a writer, and I couldn't fathom writing a novel. But I graduated and had no idea what to do. I worked for a year at a law firm because if you're verbal, everyone says you should be a lawyer. I really didn't want to be a lawyer, and kind of on a whim, I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop. And then I got in, to my surprise, and suddenly I had 2 years where someone was paying me, and I knew where I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to be doing. And that was when I really became serious about my writing, and when it started to seem maybe there was a tiny chance that this could be my career. The year after I finished at Iowa, I had a little bit of fellowship money, and I spent 8 months on Nantucket through the dead of winter writing my first novel, which was called Seating Arrangements. And of the many, many things I didn't know about books and book publishing, I didn't know it would take a couple years for the book to come out when I sold it, which I did a year later. So for 2 years, I had a fellowship at Stanford in creative writing, where I was also going to workshop. During this time, I was writing short stories at Iowa and at Stanford. For me, it was just the best way to make use of feedback and to be able to get to hear what people had to say about something with a beginning, middle, and an end. And just on Tuesday, my short story collection of work starting from 2007 to 2017 was published. So it's kind of like this long road of short fiction. It's the hardback one. So Seating Arrangements was published in the summer of 2012, and fortunately, I had sold Astonish Me, my second novel, right before it came out. And I'd always gotten the excellent advice from my agent that when a book comes out, you should have another book going, because otherwise a book being published feels like this life or death situation, and it's better to sort of have some forward momentum. So I was trying to write another book. So this brings us back to the statue. I'd been traveling alone in Australia and New Zealand for a month. I'd spent the final 2 weeks driving around the South Island, admiring the landscapes, having little adventures, and theoretically working on the manuscript that I'd written 100 pages of and thought would become my third novel. I swam with hundreds of dusky dolphins in the open ocean. I hiked around the base of Mount Cook, cruised through spectacular fjords, and landed on a glacier in a plane equipped with skis. The one thing I did not do was write. In fact, by the time I arrived at the airport to leave, my manuscript was officially dead. Sometimes these things happen, but when you don't have an idea for your next novel, it feels like you'll never have another one ever again. I was waiting for the first round of edits on Astonish Me, and it wouldn't be published for another year and a half. I was 29, and up until then, I had had a youthful, blithely confident notion of myself as someone who put out a book every 2 years, which is really difficult to do if your manuscript dies and you don't have any other ideas. So there she was at the airport in Auckland. She was standing next to the lane where taxis drop people off, a bronze woman in a belted overcoat, balanced on the balls of her booted feet, one arm cradling a bouquet of flowers, and the other raised aloft as though she were waving to a crowd. There was a plaque that explained that this was Jean Batten, a Kiwi pilot who, in 1936, had become the first person to fly solo from England to New Zealand. It included a quote, "I was destined to be a wanderer. In flying, I found speed and freedom to roam the earth." My travels had made me feel adventurous, and Jean Batten's words resonated with me. Right then and there, I decided I would write a book about a pilot. Simple. I'll remind you, this was 2012. What a fool. Nothing about writing Great Circle was simple. The word I use most frequently in describing the process is, in fact, nightmare. For more than a year after I saw the statue, I was busy editing Astonish Me, and my thinking made little progress beyond book about pilot. Right before Astonish Me was published in April of 2014, I spent 2 months in Missoula, Montana. I was there for 2 reasons. One was that I didn't really live anywhere, and I was trying to figure out where to live, and I thought maybe Missoula was the place. The other was that I was trying to finally get started on my pilot book, and in the past it had worked well for me to write when I was living somewhere random. I rented a house from a friend of a friend on the side of a mountain, and in 2 months, again, I wrote almost nothing. What I did write about this pilot was set in Nebraska, because that's where I thought she would come from. Only after I left Missoula did it occur to me that, actually, Missoula was a pretty good place for a pilot to grow up in the 1920s. And it had the advantage of that I'd actually spent time there. Nebraska was a state I'd only driven across, usually as quickly as possible. Sorry, Nebraska. I've never been someone who can plot out my books in advance, and so when I sat down to actually, finally, for real, start writing some months later, in the fall of 2014, all I knew was that my pilot, whom I'd named Marion Graves, would disappear while trying to fly around the world north-south in 1950, and that she would transport warplanes during World War II, although I hadn't decided if she would do that in the US or the UK, both of which were historically possible. I had my first line, too, lightly adapted from Jean Batten. I was born to be a wanderer. I wrote a short section in Marion's voice, a snippet of the logbook she leaves behind in Antarctica before vanishing. Then, to my surprise, I had an impulse to begin the story with an ocean liner being launched in Glasgow in 1909, 5 years before my heroine would even be born. This meant I had to stop everything before I'd even gotten started in order to track down a lot of information about Glasgow and ocean liners and ship launches, and then, for the next major plot point, how ocean liners sink. This was pretty much how writing the whole book went. I would think I knew what I was doing, where I was going, and then some other idea would occur to me, inevitably complicating the whole. I'd stop to do the necessary research, and while I was researching, another tantalizing rabbit hole would materialize, and so on and so forth. I like to say now that writing my first draft was like swimming upstream, like building a giant house without any blueprints and ending up with weird turrets and staircases to nowhere. Basically, it was messy and difficult and uncertain and seemingly endless. Just before I'd started writing in earnest, I had moved to LA, to Atwater Village, and settled in a tiny bungalow where I had the luxury of a dedicated office. Quickly, my new bookshelves filled with an eclectic, even eccentric library of used books I ordered off the internet. Books about airplanes and ships in Antarctica and the Arctic and Alaska and Montana and Canadian landscape painters and bootleggers and war. I collected pilots' memoirs, including Gene Batten's, and plowed through fat biographies, slender technical manuals, photo-filled Time Life volumes, and vintage hardbacks with crumbling dust jackets. One day I sat down and, to my own surprise, wrote a section in the first-person voice of a modern Hollywood movie star, and so the second timeline of the book was born. Amelia Earhart is the female pilot everyone's heard of, the only one who still makes for an identifiable Halloween costume. But in the 1920s and 30s, there were plenty of others who regularly made headlines. There was Eleanor Smith, Bessie Coleman, Pancho Barnes, Ruth Nichols, Jacqueline Cochran, Lady Mary Heath, Beryl Markham, Amy Johnson, just to name a handful. They were bold, fascinating women who had to shoulder their way into the macho world of early flying to fight for the opportunity to choose their own risks. These women are no longer household names, but that's not because they weren't famous or accomplished in their time. It's because they peacefully retired from flying, or if they died young, did so in more straightforward ways than vanishing into the Pacific. I firmly believe that Amelia Earhart is overwhelmingly likely to have crashed and drowned and was never a prisoner or a castaway, and that the mystery that surrounds her is largely artificial and sometimes cynically propagated. But as I started to write Great Circle, I mulled over how difficult the fact of her death was for people to accept. Did all these fanciful theories about Amelia persist because she was a woman? Because it's too painful for us to contemplate such an abrupt and lonely end for someone so vibrant and compelling, so easy to admire? Because we simply don't like that ending for her story and wish for further adventures, for a final twist? I wondered, as I wrote about my vanished pilot, why we process disappearance and death so differently when they are often the same thing. I wasn't content with just sitting at home and reading either. I was building the character of Marion Graves into someone driven by a need for freedom and a desire to witness as much of the planet as possible. She was obsessed with questions of scale. How do you measure your life against the scale of the Earth? How do you measure your life against time? A human life is both immeasurably huge and inconceivably tiny, as is the planet we live on. To understand Marion, I thought I needed to be more like her, to feed my own insatiable hunger to see, to go. About a year into writing my first draft, in 2015, I was serendipitously offered assignments by 2 different travel magazines. For one, I stayed home and wrote a profile of a ballet dancer who lived between New York and Moscow. For the other, I went to Hawaii. After that, I started to pitch my own ideas for stories. Not all of them went through, but some did. The trip that most changed my life happened early in my travel writing career. It was the first trip I pitched, and it was on a 50-passenger ship, a former Russian research vessel, to the islands between New Zealand and Antarctica, well into the southern ocean's roaring 40s latitudes, famous for big seas, for penguins, and for southern royal albatrosses, birds with 10-foot wingspans who might not touch land for 5 years after they fledge from their nest. Albatrosses take to the sea, gliding a long loop on prevailing winds around Antarctica. Amid the rugged natural splendor, I fell into a relationship with a man who was the expedition leader. Nothing happened on that first trip, but via email, we decided we wanted to see each other again. And what turned out to be the simplest way to do that was for me to come back to New Zealand, waving hello to Jean Batten again, and for our first date, to go with him as a quasi-staff member on a 5-week trip back to the subantarctic islands and onward to the remote Ross Sea region of Antarctica. So I found myself tending bar in 30-foot seas and trying to write about Marion graves while my cabin tipped wildly back and forth. I found myself falling for someone who was at home in these icy, rugged regions, who wore shorts over long johns to hike in Antarctica, who cried while talking about seabirds. The relationship lasted less than a year. It turns out dating a seafarer who's 30 years older than you isn't easy, but its legacy lasted. My feeling that I had taken a huge, potentially foolish leap and been rewarded for it. I wrote a New York Times Modern Love about that, so you can Google if you want more details. Gradually, I established myself as a travel writer who was eager for adventure, who could make sense of the wild, barren regions that captivated Marion graves. A photographer who traveled with me once told me that his editor said he'd only ever had to buy medevac insurance for my trips, which I was very flattered by. I went to the Arctic 6 times and to Antarctica a second time, this time from South America. I swam with humpback whales in the South Pacific, searched for snow leopards in the Himalaya, and rode on horseback through Patagonia's Torres del Paine National Park and Botswana's Okavango Delta. Determined to get a sense of the Antarctic interior after seeing its coast, I pitched a story to Outside Magazine about the unit of our National Guard who does polar airlift, and I flew in the back of a C-130 cargo plane from upstate New York to Greenland. We landed on skis in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. I had the experience that I'd wanted, to stand on thousands of feet of ice in the middle of a white disk of snow under a blue dome of sky. I felt the curvature of the earth, the precariousness of its frozen places. All of this travel slowed down my writing, but I hoped it was enriching it too, giving it spirit and veracity. After more than 3 years, I had a first draft that was almost 1,000 pages long. So you guys are lucky with that paperback. To finish it had required more stamina than I knew I had. There were plenty of days when I wasn't sure where the story was going, when I had no confidence in my ability to pull it all together. I was anxious too, because by now I'd gambled years of my life on a writing project that might or might not work out. My publisher could decide not to buy it. People might hate it. Someone I had been friendly with, a man, asked me what I was working on. When I told him, he said, "Do they even let women write books that long?" But I learned to put my head down and focus on what progress I could make in a single day. Just keep going, I told myself. Don't worry about anything outside the pages you're looking at. In January 2018, I sent the completed draft to my agent and decamped for the Swedish Arctic. When I got back, she and I talked for a total of 7 hours over 3 days, going through the novel bit by bit, discussing all its problems, figuring out how to reconfigure those staircases to nowhere, deciding which weird turrets to demolish. Revising a manuscript so lengthy is almost as difficult as writing it in the first place, because every change you make ripples through hundreds of pages, requiring careful follow-up and endless adjustments. I couldn't hold it all in my head. I had to break it down, work on it bit by bit. Here was another lesson about scale. In her logbook, Marion Graves writes that inevitably we will omit almost everything. In flying the length of Africa, for instance, we will only cover one track as wide as our wings, glimpse only one set of horizons. Although Great Circle shrank from that first gigantic draft, it remained a work about bigness, about an impossible yearning for the unseen, about wanting to understand more than our puny human brains can quite handle, about how tiny our lives are and also how incomprehensible enormous. It is a book about freedom and movement and women struggling to find the right lives for themselves. My publisher bought the book in the fall of 2018 and it was published in May 2021, into a different world than the one in which I'd started writing. At home during the pandemic, my days of gallivanting around on travel assignments seemed like a different life. But almost 7 years after I saw Jean Batten's statue, at least I could finally set Marian off on her own journey. Her life isn't with me anymore, but with readers, as it should be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Wow, you've been around the world a few times, literally and figuratively. Okay. All right. So, apparently you have said that Great Circle is a love letter to the planet. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a cliche to describe things as being love letters to other things, but I did mean in writing the book to express some of the awe that I'd felt on these travels for the natural world and try to bring that into the story without it becoming bogged down in description. I wanted to sort of express what I'd felt, especially in the remote regions and the polar regions, which is that these are parts of the Earth that are just going about their business without us, and we're having a catastrophic effect on them, but they don't know we're there. My first time in Antarctica to the Ross Sea, it's so hard to get there. From the last of the subantarctic islands, it's 5 full days at sea. You know, and when you go from South America, it's 1 day at sea. You go to almost 70 degrees south. And so I found myself in this place that in some ways wants to kill you. It's incredibly harsh, it's inhospitable, but that's the beauty of it. It's a place that's sort of independent from the world that we've built. So yeah, as much as I could, I wanted to transport people with this book and to also sort of potentially encourage people to consider what they really want to see with their lives, and that might be something really close to home or it might be something very far away.
Thank you. Marian is rather fluid in her sexual identity. Were you commenting on gender expectations when you gave Marian so much freedom?
No, because I don't plan my books, I never have an agenda. I start with questions rather than answers. And Marian, as a character, she and her twin brother are raised by their sort of dissolute artist uncle in Missoula in the 20s and 30s. It's extremely hands-off guardianship. And so she spends her early childhood sort of without it occurring to her that her gender might be a limitation. And when she realizes that she has to fly, she's particularly taken aback by how much more difficult it is to convince people to teach her as a woman or to secure the funding she needs to fly. And so for Marian, at certain times in her life, it's expedient to sort of exist in an in-between place in terms of gender. And she also she wasn't raised with sort of the markers of femininity and the expectations of femininity, so she's guided by her desire to do what she wants to do, and for freedom, she doesn't want a domestic life. And one thing I came to understand while writing about her is that decision to lead an unorthodox life isn't just one decision, it's a decision she has to make over and over and over again, and it involves very real sacrifice.
On a different subject, how does it feel to be shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize?
It felt great. It was very exciting. It is incredibly stressful. I didn't anticipate. I went over in November for the Booker Prize, which was in person. It was virtual the year before. And it's a lot of hubbub, especially coming out of the pandemic when I hadn't been doing anything in person. And publisher really, really wants you to win because they sell so many books, and they all have book orders placed for the night of the prize. And if you win, they send it through, and if you don't, they cancel it. And they make sure you know this. And due to COVID, it was also, traditionally the Booker is a banquet hall like this, a black tie dinner, and they announce the award pretty late at night when everyone's pretty squiffy. But for ours, it was in an empty theater at the BBC with just the 6 finalists, and we could each bring one or two guests, and it was very strange and very tense, but I was very happy for Damon Galgut, who won. He'd been shortlisted twice before, and having gone through that experience just once, I was glad for him. And we were on a little shuttle bus after the prize, and he'd stayed behind to do a press conference, and one of the other shortlistees said, "A moment of silence for Damon," and we all laughed.
That's great. So we understand that you research female pilots to write Marion's story. Do you want to get a pilot's license?
No. I thought about it at the beginning. My brother just retired from the Air Force after 20 years, and for the first part of his career, he was a C-130 pilot. So I'd grown up around someone who desperately wanted to fly from early childhood and knew it in his bones, and almost every pilot I've talked with really wanted to be a pilot. And so the fact that I didn't seemed like a good reason to me not to do it. I don't have great spatial relations. I don't trust my instincts in that sort of three-dimensional space. I was at the controls of a glider for a few minutes, and I made one turn, and I was like, nope, 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 nope. This is not for me. But I did what I could to experience more forms of flight. You know, we're so used to looking sideways out of airplanes, and so I rode in planes where I could look out the front, lots of planes that landed on snow or ice, helicopters, yeah, small planes like that. So I tried to enlarge my experience, but from pretty early on, I knew I didn't want to be a pilot.
So listening to you, you have some pretty high-energy adventures. To me, they sound terrifying. Are you scared on some of these things when the ship is going up and down and the plane is going? How do you handle it?
Yeah, I am scared sometimes. I think part of what the cumulative effect has been over the years of writing travel pieces and particularly sort of specializing in adventure travel is that my comfort zone has expanded dramatically. And I've also been, as I said in my talk, I've been rewarded for taking risks, which is incentive to keep doing it. Like, I did a story for Travel and Leisure where I swam with humpback whales in the open ocean, and I've always been afraid of deep water, but I also desperately wanted to do it. And so I, went and jumped off this small boat into kind of Big Blue, not knowing if it would just be an exercise in fear control, and it ended up being fine. And the same was probably true of the first time I was in really big seas. Both those trips from New Zealand, you get 30 to 35-foot swells are truly big. And I also discovered I don't really get seasick, which ended up being a huge advantage. So yeah, it's really been a process. And I would say my relationship with fear has really evolved in writing and researching this book. I've also encountered more and more people who are truly adventurous and truly competent in the wilderness, and seeing what they can do and how this is sort of a casual part of their lives to do things that I would find terrifying. That's also sort of makes you feel like a child or something. You think, okay, maybe I can do more than I think.
Thank you. So back to the book. Your novel holds the juxtaposition of two different stories. What was your thinking that led you to put them together? I know you mentioned you started speaking in the voice of an actress.
Yeah, so the two plot lines, it's more heavily weighted toward Marion, the pilot, that's the bulk of the book, and then Hadley is a movie star in 2014, I think, playing her in a biopic, and she gets sort of drawn into this mystery of what happened to Marion. So when I first wrote a section in Hadley's voice, it didn't have anything to do with the pilot book I was writing, but I just had the sense that this was the missing piece. And some of it was tonal. It gave me a chance to use a different voice and to sort of break up what would otherwise be a real log of historical fiction, and to write something that didn't require a lot of research. But as I kept working, she took on a greater significance to me, which is that she became a lens on how much is lost when we die and when a life is over. Hadley's trying to recreate Marion sort of at the end of this game of telephone. Marion left behind a logbook, which is turned into a novel, which is being made into this movie. And so the reader can see, with the contrast of what Hadley can figure out and what the reader knows about Marion, how huge the gap is and how much of our lives is private in a way. So that allowed me to get more depth into the book, and to say something about, the legacy of a life.
Great, those are our questions. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Nora up.